I'm really excited to actually talk to you about a regulatory change. I know that's an unusual phrase to say. However, this regulatory change is really going to change the way we're looking at sustainability. These are changes that have happened and regulatory changes that have happened in Europe, but they're impacting the whole world. So we're going to talk today about the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Disclosure. And this is a pivotal regulation really aimed at enhancing transparency and comparability of sustainability related disclosures among EU listed companies. But don't think you'll escape if you're private. There's definitely some issues there. So the EU CSRD really is ushering in a world where sustainability reporting will be the subject of the same level of rigor and control as financial reporting. So people who have been working in sustainability for a long time, such as myself, this is actually a very, very good thing in the maturing of the sustainability journey overall. That said, it is a lot more complicated than the voluntary disclosures you may be more familiar with. It has, for example, the SRS, which we'll discuss later, has over 1,000 potential disclosure points. And the directive requires double materiality assessments, limited assurance, electronic tagging. So it's not really too much to say that companies that are impacted or covered companies, as we say, really need to start their compliance journey now. So what we're going to talk about today, Sarah briefly mentioned there, is we're really going to look and break down a couple of these key acronyms, the CSRD, as I mentioned, also the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. And then what we're going to look at, we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into double materiality and really what that means and what it means for this regulation as well, because there's some very specific points of that, but there's also some leverage for companies to tell their own story and their own narrative. And we're going to bring it all together and hopefully answer some of your questions. It is a rather technical and rather complicated amount and type of information that we're going to go through. So I'm going to try and keep it digestible and do my best to get through most of this. It'll be challenging to answer any technical questions without knowing your company's background very, very deeply. So any kind of questions that we have, we'll just do our best on that. And we're happy to answer questions afterwards. One question that will come up is, will we be sharing these slides? Unfortunately, no, but we are recording this session. So the recording will be made available later on. So let's begin. What is the CSRD? Let's start with where the CSRD actually falls within the EU regulatory framework where sustainability is concerned. So if you look over onto the side, one side of the screen there, you have the NFRD, another terrible acronym, but this is a non-financial reporting directive. And the CSRD is really meant to expand upon the NFRD, and it introduces mandatory reporting requirements for a much broader range of sustainability factors, including environmental, social, and governance aspects. And so when you look at over on the blue box there, what you see is there's been a journey, a compliance journey where things have started to grow and change from an overall aim at trying to make sustainability information clearer and easier to understand. So when I started working in sustainability, a lot of the information was very qualitative. Whilst there's a space for qualitative information in sustainability, it's very hard to compare apples to apples when you have two companies in the same industry that are competing with each other. How do you judge how their non-financial materiality plus their financial materiality plus their sustainability impacts all impact corporate performance today and how it may impact corporate performance in the future? So the purpose of these regulations are to really start to clear that up. Now, though this is a regulation that is impacting the EU is really using its market power to actually make global sustainability reporting much more robust, because any entity within certain factors, but entities that are operating within Europe are going to have to report on this. Now, how is the Japanese government looking at this? So very similarly to the governance code, for example, the Japanese government is watching this very carefully to see which aspects go well, which aspects don't go well, what we might want to integrate into Japan in the future. So my opinion and the opinion of our firm is that we do think that this journey is not going to stop at Europe. I think we're definitely going to see more of this moving forward. A final point on new regulatory regimes. I think one thing that is really important to remember is, because this is new, there's going to be some unanswered questions, and there's always going to be that area of gaps. And that's where the regulators and the business community are kind of expected to grow on that journey together. So it's parts of it are very prescriptive. Other parts you still have the ability to question, to make decisions that fit your company best. So again, consider this a journey, not a final destination, but definitely where the world's going. So let's look at the CSRD specifically. And I think one of those key points is right up there in blue. This is going to expand the NFRD's 11,000 companies to about 50,000, and as many as about 10,000 foreign companies, including Japanese companies. So if we take a step back, April 2021, the EU Commission announced the adoption of the CSRD in line with the commitment it made under with the European Green Deal. So the CSRD will amend the existing NFRD's gaps, and it substantially increases the reporting requirements. This can be very, very challenging. Of course, nobody likes hearing expanded reporting requirements, but again, the ultimate aim here is really value creation and understanding value creation. So investors are looking at this very seriously, perhaps even including retail investors in the future as well. So the directive also dramatically increases the number of companies, as we mentioned. That's a huge amount of compliance that is now expected, and definitely impacting us here in Japan and across the region. The reporting is not new to any of us. The preparation of the ESG report that is going to meet the requirements of the CSRD, it comes with its own challenges and opportunities. And some of them are mentioned here, and these are the really key ones. So double materiality, this is really the linchpin for the CSRD. And one of the key points we're going to have to look at, and we'll look at this a little bit later in the presentation, is getting that materiality assessment correct. Because if you have 1,150 points that you need to be, that are mandated here, but you actually only need to be reporting on 800 of them, then that's something that is going to be coming out through your double materiality. So you really want to focus on that double materiality as a piece that's going to help you shape the amount of compliance work you want to do. You're not going to have to do every single data point if it's not relevant for your company. So I think that's really important to remind yourselves of. So if you're looking at other areas that make this very unique, limited assurance. So just skipping down to that third point there. So I know this makes my old colleagues in EY very, very happy, and the other Big Four very happy, but limited assurance is going to be a requirement. And when you think about limited assurance and you think about this journey of a brand new regulatory framework, you have to imagine that there's going to be learnings on both sides. So you need to start to, if you don't already, start to identify who might be your limited assurance partner for your sustainability report, because all of the data you're going to be collecting needs to be auditable. And I think this is something that people tend to want to think about later on in the process. However, the conversations that we're having with our team in Japan and also our team in the US is really emphasizing the fact that you probably want to identify who these partners are and start speaking to them earlier than you may otherwise be considering. The final point there, I think that is very, very interesting, is the electronic tagging. So we'll talk about that a little bit more going forward as well. But this is something that I think is definitely not going to be going away and is going to be really, really important moving forward. So when we're looking at the eligibility requirements and the reporting timeline, so if you have already been reporting for NFRD, then you're automatically going to be reporting to CSRD soon. However, non-EU companies have a little bit more time, and there's some threshold pieces there that you need to consider. But if you're thinking about reporting, you have to think about the data and the data that you'll be reporting on. So fiscal years starting on or after January 1st, 2024, for example, would report in 2025. Fiscal years on or after January 2025 would report 2026 and therefore and so on. So when you're considering when you're going to be reporting, the scope of work that is involved in actually getting you ready to report is likely to take 2 or 3 years to start to get right. And I don't say that to scare you. I just say that in the sense of if you start looking at it sooner, you have a much better chance of getting a process in place that you're going to use, not for 1 year, you're going to be using this for multiple years in the future. And I think it's very, very important to start that process as early as possible, because unfortunately, this is not going to be going away. Another way of looking at the timeline, it's very nice to put little boxes in years, but actually this timeline is rather aggressive and it will creep up on you very quickly. So as I just mentioned, when you're starting to consider how ready are you for CSRD, you're going to have a few options. And I'll just pop to the next slide because this is probably more interesting to this group here, is really what non-EU companies are going to have to do. And if you look here, you really have 3 key options. So you've got the publish the report for just your EU subsidiary, consolidate all your EU subsidiaries, or consolidate it into your global report. There's not one hard and fast answer for every reporting and for every company. So you do have these options. I suggest you take a thoughtful approach to what might make most sense. One of the companies that my US team was looking at, and we were in discussions as well to support, is really looking at starting more from a European only perspective, but their ultimate goal is to have good global reporting that integrates all of these pieces. They feel like we do that the world is going to get more interested in transparency on these issues. So the consolidated global report is their goal, but they're going to roadmap that out. We've listed some pros and cons here down at the bottom. So there's, again, this is really going to be subject to not just your reporting maturity overall, but what your ultimate goals are from that consideration. So I think that's something that you need to thoughtfully consider with your stakeholder group. As we mentioned earlier, the element of the mandatory limited assurance is a real key differentiator. I actually think this is again a great piece to have. And I think one of the reasons, yes, it's going to add cost. Yes, it's going to add a lot more time, but it's also going to allow you to have a lot more trust in the market. When you start to look at, again, that apples to apples approach, if you've got the limited assurance behind you that gives more credibility to your information, I think that can provide a real competitive advantage moving forward. But again, because of the cost and the requirements that for the first couple of years might be a little bit challenging to comply to, it's very, very important to start that conversation really early, because you're going to need to have a partner that is going to work with you on that. And I did bold this in the last point there. They do have to be accredited in the EU member states. So I think generally that shouldn't be a problem, but it is important to consider. So we're also looking at, this is the other kind of very interesting piece. We're looking at this electronic filing requirements. This will also add, I'm giving you all the cheery news, it will also add more cost and time, and you need to find partners and vendors. So XBRL and iXBRL. So this is tagging, but the iXBRL is an enhancement of that. And it actually focuses on rendering data in a human readable format. So the tags get embedded in line in the document, and that actually does make it easier to reduce inaccuracies. So there are positives on the efficiency side for you moving forward. But again, you're going to need to consider, I think most companies I've worked with here haven't really started to consider this yet. And I think this is something that will eventually make your lives easier after a period of adjustment. So that overall, so those are some of those key aspects of the CSRD that does make it very, very different. The requirements that make it so much different from the voluntary disclosure that we have been doing for a long time. Pluses and minuses to all of them. And certainly the first couple years are going to be challenging. So if you are a company that has a small amount of exposure, for example, doing a European entity only report is probably a great way to go to work out some of those challenges early on, so that when you want to expand or when you need to expand that reporting, you have processes in place that help you make sure that you're not only compliant, but that you are utilizing this in the best possible way. I know this is a lot of information. It's very difficult to cut it down without losing key aspects of it. So we're going to move on to the European reporting standards. And really, what do they do? They're really important because they enhance transparency. They're aligned with EU policy. This really offers a comprehensive framework. I think one of the best before this would probably be GRI, and many of my clients here have been reporting for GRI for years. So I think in that sense, this shouldn't be too terrible to look at. This will help us standardize reporting and really create uniformity, which is something that's been very, very much lacking. And this really does encourage stakeholder engagement. It is not required per se in the same way, and very prescriptive in the same way that other pieces are, but the stakeholder engagement piece is actually very, very important and something you should consider. We'll touch on that a bit later. And it's really, this is what's going to help us promote best practices in the industry. So it'll be very interesting to see how we move forward after the first couple of years of reporting have gone. And then we'll really be able to tell an interesting story. So how are they really structured? So you've got ESRS 2, and then you have the ESRS topic specific disclosures. So if you look at ESRS 2, this is probably very, very familiar to anybody that's looked at TCFD, and it should be. So you've got the governance, you've got strategy, metrics and targets, and impact, right? So you've got those areas are very, very familiar. But then we also get into topic specific. So we're looking at a greater depth, particularly from the social side. The governance side we'll look at later. To be fair, is not a huge amount of difference from what you'd probably expect, but the E and the S piece are expanded in ways that you may or may not have been touching on. Now, again, keep in mind, if some of these points are absolutely out of scope or irrelevant for your company, you don't need to fill every gap. You really need to tell your story, which is why that double materiality, which we'll talk about later, will really help you figure out what you need to be focused on. So let's look at a little bit on, and I know this slide is very, very tiny. I apologize for that, but when you're looking across that top, we've got climate change, pollution, water and marine resources. Depending on the type of company that you are, you've likely been reporting on these areas. So you've got the material, impact, risk and opportunities, policies, metrics and targets. I don't think that is too unusual. But when you start to look at biodiversity and circular economy, we've seen a lot of kind of news and excitement over things like biodiversity standards, the TNFD, for example. But there still seems to be a lot of confusion as how to do this and how to do this well. So I think this is going to be an area which could be a little bit challenging. Not on the slide here, scope 3 emissions. So scope 3 emissions, also an area where it's a little bit tricky. It's a little bit difficult to understand. Are you capturing all of the right information in a standard way across your full supply chain, for example, and even broader, your value chain, which is ultimately what we're looking to capture for each company. Where are the challenges, those risks, also the opportunities across your full value chain? So the weak points that I would probably see for some of my clients moving forward might be that biodiversity and circular economy piece, looking at that end of life, particularly for products, companies, more so certainly than service. In the social side, an even smaller slide for you. Again, very, very, very sorry for how small that is. But if you're looking actually at this centerpiece, if at all, you can see it, affected communities. What you're looking at here, in some areas, this might be standard practice, for example, looking at Indigenous rights. Not something we talk about a lot in Japan, but something we talk about a lot with my US colleagues and certainly my Australian and New Zealand colleagues. So again, if this is going to be in scope and relevant for your company, these are some things that you're going to have to look at. Civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, certainly human rights, equality, and other work-related rights. So some of the reporting that we've already been looking at has touched on a lot of this. This expands it greatly. And traditionally speaking, with reporting and disclosure, what you see is environmental and governance pieces are a little more straightforward to report on. The social side can be much more challenging, particularly because there can be still a degree of subjectivity or qualitative information trying to play a role as quantitative information. So you need to think very carefully about which areas in your materiality are going to identify that you need to either enhance or start from the beginning and create a data trail on them. One more piece here on ESRS and the topics covered is that governance piece. And again, here, I don't really think we see anything too terribly exciting. Really looking at different kinds of reporting requirements and the topics that they cover. Nothing too here interesting. Perhaps interesting, we've seen this at least in the US, political contributions and lobbying activities, remuneration. Remuneration is becoming a bigger issue in Japan, which is interesting. Traditionally, companies have not wanted to talk about that, but remuneration, I think we'll start to see a lot more conversation on, and certainly certain disclosures have already been asking for something on that. So yeah, stay tuned for that to see how that grows and changes, but it's something that you need to start to consider. So hopefully you're all still with me again. I know this is a lot of information. Sustainability, people like me get really excited about this because this is such a great step forward for us, considering where we've been in the past. However, it can be clunky at first. And I think one of the areas that is going to be a little bit clunky begins with even the term double materiality. I'm not a fan of this term. It makes sense for the short term, but not for the long term. And I'll tell you why. But double materiality is really the cornerstone of CSRD. This is what's going to determine your issue and topics that you're going to report on. Important to note here, there's actually no defined process or methodology. So that is, if you've got a defined process or methodology that you've been using, then you might just be able to expand that. So typically what we've been looking at from materiality, which is, we've never used this term, but single materiality, has been the financial materiality. What is the impacts of environmental, social, and governance issues on your business, and how can that potentially negatively and perhaps positively impact your business? The double part comes into adding in impact materiality. And that is, what are your company's activities that are actually impacting environment and society in a positive or negative way? Usually they're really looking at the negative impacts, but there's positive impacts, which you'll probably want to highlight as well. So it's not just the outside in, but it's also the inside out that you need to look at it, that you need to look at from now. And for me, this is materiality. This is a true holistic materiality. So what I'm hoping and what I think is likely is that within 5 years, we don't use this clunky term double materiality. We're just going to call it materiality, because that's a much more holistic picture of risk and opportunities than we've seen in the past. Probably something, I mean, we've spoken to a lot of companies already, probably something you've already started to consider. Some of the companies we've spoken to have already done theirs, have already looked at it. And again, and I can't stress this enough, the reason why this is such a cornerstone is because I don't think there's a single company out there that really wants to report on 1,150 data points. Doing a robust double materiality should eliminate some of those for you. I'd be absolutely shocked if it didn't. And that's important because you want to be efficient in compliance as well. And if you have a robust double materiality, you're going to be able to report more accurately, as well as being more efficiently and more efficient. So let's take a closer look. So when we're just looking at this, again, this is such an important area. We've got the ESG impacts on the company's impacts on the world. So the way we're talking about it is, again, the financial materiality and the impact materiality. And I think this is probably pretty obvious for everyone. And I won't try and belabor the point beyond this slide, but when you're looking at really like renewable energies to power your plants and whatnot. So you're looking at that kind of financial materiality. But when you're looking at your impact materiality, one of the unpopular ones that is looking at is, again, end of life. What does product end of life look like? That's where you start to also look at circular economy. What are the impacts of not just your product, but for example, your facilities? Where are your facilities? It's a very simple image to think of when you have a factory near a river and the factory is polluting that river. So what are the impacts to that river? What's the impact to the whole community that relies on that river? Whereas before you might have just been looking at that river is now flooding much more regularly than it used to, and that's impacting your factory, right? So think about it more holistically. And then you get a much better picture of where your risks and, again, potential opportunities are. Do you need to move that factory? Do you need better technology around a levee system, for example? Do you need to stop polluting it? And how do you stop polluting it? So these are not simple questions to be asking, and in most of your businesses, these won't be new, but you're going to be asked within this compliance regime to look at all of these deeply and have a strategy around it. So I think that's important to consider. So we're looking at your material IROs, so your impacts, your risks, and your opportunities. And where this is kind of interesting is because you're looking at it by location, value chain, and time horizon. And you want to provide the most truthful and accurate representation when you're disclosing the severity of the related impact. So it becomes really challenging there, because part of it, when you're forward thinking on how impactful something is going to be, you have to use your best possible estimations. But for risks and opportunities, you really need to reflect the magnitude, for example, current financial effects and the magnitude of the likely anticipated financial effects. This can be a little bit more of an art than a science, particularly when you're looking at that forward view. So the two pieces there that become very important to remember are, some of your impacts are only going to be at certain sites and certain companies that you are in your group, and others are actually only going to happen during certain time horizons. But you're looking at the whole value chain, which is, again, a little bit different. We're still trying in some companies to get a good handle on supply chain, and beyond supply chain, you need to start to consider your full value chain. So a couple more slides on the materiality aspects, because we're going to look very quickly here at impact materiality scoring. A very interesting piece of this is you actually don't have to disclose all of the details. If you create a beautiful matrix on which areas are more or less impactful, you don't have to disclose all of that information, but you do have to disclose whether the actual or potential positive or negative impacts, and give it some kind of score. Some people see a visual matrix and it has a different response for them, but don't think you have to disclose in a certain way. But the information has to be disclosed, and also whether it's going to be in the short, medium, or long-term time horizon. So think about scale, scope, and the severity. The likelihood of an impact is going to be very interesting. Again, if we take another water example, one that a lot of us are familiar with is, building property, insuring property near the ocean line. For example, we've got beach erosion. That's been something we've talked about for a long time, but now we have rising tides as well. How can we build them? What's the risks of building them? What's the risks of them being destroyed? How do we insure them? What's the risk of them being uninsurable? Are we going to end up with stranded assets? And you can look at probability. This is an important part, because this is not prescriptive. You could do something like, you could use general terms like likely, highly likely, highly unlikely, or you could use some kind of probability, like there's a 1 in 10 chance, a 10 in 100 chance, or a frequency over time, for example, once every 10 years, once every 5 years. So again, that you need to have a thoughtful look at what story you need to be telling in a way that's going to disclose these risks in a way that aligns with your company the best. So financial materiality is the other real key aspect of this. Nothing really shocking here. I think when you're looking at the financial materiality piece, I think this is probably something that most of you are very, very comfortable with to a large degree. So I won't really spend much time on that. But again, we've got that likelihood, magnitude, time horizon piece. I'm aware of time, so move forward a bit. Stakeholder engagement. So before we end this section, I do want to have a little bit of a moment to talk about stakeholder engagement. So stakeholder engagement certainly can include your shareholders. What is really different with CSRD, I think, is when you consider the quality of data you're going to get. So maybe in the past, you might have sent out a lot of surveys, you get various, you hope people complete them, you get various sorts of data points. When you're looking at your CSRD requirements and even your double materiality requirements, you're going to be looking a lot more at an interview format, and you're going to want to really look carefully at which stakeholder groups which types of stakeholders, where they're located. So really having that stakeholder engagement piece, you really need to go back to a stakeholder mapping and understand where are you going to get the best data for the work and for the ultimate disclosure, because what you don't want is a bunch of random information that can't really be used in a way that's going to tell the narrative that you need to and meet the compliance requirements that you have. So before even an engagement, many companies here have already done this, but consider the mapping of who are the real key stakeholders. And to add another level to this, the key stakeholders, if you're looking from a group perspective, may be different at the group holding company level than they would be at the single entity level. Very, very much the same with the financial impacts and the material impacts and there, because what you're looking at from impact materiality and from financial materiality for the group might be very, very different for individual plants in individual areas, individual companies, individual areas. So do consider that piece. And hopefully I haven't scared you all terribly too much. Again, let's just pull this all together and realizing there's a lot more technical detail behind all of these pieces, but really trying to give you a very broad yet semi-deep understanding. Where does this all go? So you've done your double materiality, you've started to talk to companies and vendors that are going to support on the electronic tagging and on your limited assurance. Ultimately, what you're going to be producing is a sustainability report, and they're called sustainability statements. Now, what's different here and what the key difference is in a voluntary reporting framework is that these reports are going to be, in some ways, a lot drier than the sustainability reports we have been doing. They're going to look a lot more like a financial report. And so you may want to even consider doing 2 reports, to be honest. And I'll tell you why. And I know you're thinking 2 reports, that's, shocking. You have to have the report that's going to meet your regulatory compliance. Absolutely. You're going to have to do that, similar to your financial report. But who else is going to want to read some of this information? So if you consider your whole stakeholder groups, if you have a 150-page report listing all of the proper data, it's unlikely to tell the narrative of your story's sustainability journey in a way that's going to really do it justice. It's going to give the data points, and you need to have those. But maybe what you need to consider is having a regulatory compliant report and another type of report. And that other type of report is something that is going to speak in, forgive me, more human language and not regulatory language to your broader group of stakeholders in a way that is going to be compelling. So here's where I think you should start to kind of pull away from the idea of this is a check the box regulatory requirement and we can do this. Here's where your opportunity is. And your opportunity is to not only meet those disclosure requirements, but actually tell your sustainability story in a compelling way. And to be quite frank, most companies don't. And they expect that people read their reports and understand all the work that went into them. They probably don't. And I think this reporting requirement is going to make the likelihood of your sustainability story being heard less likely. So perhaps start to consider how you can tell your story and yet still comply, right? So let's look at the roadmap. What do you need to start doing? And not all of this needs to be done at the exact same time, but you do need to start to consider it. If you look at the little green flag there, there's no note on that, but what that is the little green flag tells you that this is an area of the reporting and the journey where you can probably have some kind of technology software support that is going to help you ultimately with that reporting. So in the US and here for Sodali, we've got a partnership with a company called Workiva. Other companies might have other partnerships. There's certainly no shortage of different software to help you on that sustainability journey. But make sure that if you're considering one and you haven't been using one in the past, or if you're reevaluating what you have, is it going to help you with all of your compulsory disclosure requirements? And so just kind of keep that in mind. And the other thing to keep in mind, again, from the beginning, is, are you going to have enough data and the correct data? And where do you need data? So the first thing you need to do is figure out what entities, for example, are going to be in scope. And that's very important for Japanese companies, because naturally not all of your companies are going to be in scope being based here, but which ones are going to be. That double materiality assessment becomes very, very important. Another piece here that's super important, you do not need to recreate the wheel. You have been doing reporting for a while. You've been doing stakeholder engagement for a while. Look at all of the existing disclosure and processes that you have, and then figure out what's missing. Which data points are missing that you might need to consider, and start filling in those gaps now. So I mentioned before, we had some definitely scope 3. We've seen some patchy reporting on scope 3. That's something that seems to be coming up time and time again when we're starting to look at this. Looking at, again, getting your assurance partner and your electronic tagging put into place, start considering doing that. So if you have a very robust program for sustainability already, you may think that you need maybe just the 1 or 2 years that we recommend here, which I think should be enough for most very, very large companies who have already been down a lot of this road already. The road has just gone from a dirt road, maybe even a trail, to a dirt road, and now it's paved with recycled Coke bottles. It's really, the road is getting better and clearer for us, but it's still a pretty long one. So if you're a smaller company or an SME who hasn't been doing this, and you are going to be covered, you really need to start with that scoping analysis, but you maybe need to focus a little bit more on what the scope of your data is, and where your gaps are, because in completing that and filling in the missing areas, you're going to want to make sure that those are going to be auditable data and metrics. So of all of those things, again, let me just leave you with three real main things. Look at your scope, do your double materiality. The double materiality is something that you can absolutely do yourself. You can engage companies such as myself or other advisories that can help you with that. But I think at this point, a lot of companies are doing it themselves to get that right. That's going to be your anchor for CSRD. You can start engaging with stakeholders at any time, particularly for those data gaps. And data gaps in your supply chain is a great example. You're going to need to get them on board. And my final point there is really create a feasible plan for this. You probably have some inroads already, some styles already working that have given you some good results. Create a feasible plan. This is a big compliance issue. It is not something that can stay in a silo. You're going to need to include your procurement, your R&D. You need your legal team on board as well. So don't forget that this is a team sport here, and you're going to need to take a look at that very, very seriously. So I am going to end here and take questions. Thank you so much for that. And hopefully everyone is relatively still awake for that. But thank you so much, Sarah. Did you learn about CSRD now?
You should see my notes. We do have a couple of questions that have come through. Perhaps if I read them out, that might be the easiest for you.
Great.
We have one. Hi, Heather. Great presentation. Can you please comment on your thoughts on what next? Will there be new reporting directives launched in other parts of the world, or will CSRD evolve to add or change things that need to be reported, etc.? Any insights?
So what we're seeing across the EU right now is probably a good example of what we're going to see across the world. So the EU as a whole has adopted the CSRD, but it's also looking on a local level. So local regulators as well might have something to say and particular issues that they want to address within their requirements. So what we're seeing is the larger umbrella regulatory framework being put in place, and then local areas starting to look at that. What I expect to happen, with the exception of the US, and I'll come back to that in a sec, what I expect to happen across most other areas is that we start to kind of watch how our companies, for example, here in Japan, how their experience is with CSRD in the beginnings. And in the beginning, there's always forgiveness room. So they keep that in mind. We've got a little bit of space where we can make mistakes early on, but that wiggle room definitely gets eliminated further on. I expect probably the Japanese government, for example, will take a more serious look at which areas of CSRD that they might want to start to employ. I wouldn't expect that within the next couple of years. I would probably expect that within the next 5, for example. The US is an interesting case because I think how quickly or how slowly the US is going to move forward from a regulatory perspective on sustainability is going to depend very heavily in the short term on the next election and the results of that election. I think if you go one side, we might see the US moving a little bit forward, still lagging what the EU is doing, but if we go into another direction, we might see them just fall further and further behind. That's not to say that sustainability initiatives are not being watched and that there's not a lot of activity in the US, but I think it's more what we hear of as is green hushing, companies doing the work but not wanting to talk about it. So the ESG disclosures, when they first came out, were much more robust and they're getting watered down and watered down. So I think and I think this is actually fair, that every area needs to look at what makes most sense. So I would not be in favor, for example, of the Japanese government wholeheartedly adopting the EU taxonomy even and the CSRD. I don't think that's necessarily fully appropriate and capturing everything we need to for Japanese companies. So but I do think this is the blueprint overall for where we're going to go.
Great. Thank you, Heather. Questions are flying in, so let's see if we can get through these. We have a question about SMEs, of which a third of our membership are. So this is relevant to a lot of BCCJ members. Please expand briefly on which SMEs are in scope or not in scope of CSRD, which I believe was mentioned in one of your first slides.
Yes, it is. And I should actually just pull that back up so we can take a look at that. So when you're looking at, I'm just going to look at my slide over here. Actually, just let me reshare it. And that just makes it a little bit easier. I know we've got so much information on these slides, and usually I'm the first person to say, take some of the information off the slides because there's too much on there. And in this case, I was just terrible and left so much information on there. So the thresholds you're going to see are right over here and under 2029, which I think are very interesting. So you've got you've got not the PEI side, but if you've got you've got the 10 employee thresholds, you've got the 900,000 euro net turnover, and you've got the total asset piece. So if you are going to be smaller than that, then this is something that you can just comfortably sit back and watch. But I feel that this is probably going to impact a lot more companies than we expect initially. That said, your reporting requirements will go the same in overall scope. I think a lot of the SMEs, if you do that double materiality correctly, I think it's going to be very limited what you're going to need to do, because by the very nature of your businesses, your impact should actually be less than what you'd expect at a large company.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Something
else you touched on, perhaps very briefly. Do you think these new regulations will apply only to companies or also investment vehicles as well, such as funds?
We already actually have different requirements for the funds already. So funds, even before this, have been subject to explaining their sustainability requirements from a strategy perspective, as well as from their funding. So the EU has actually been very forward thinking in this already. And I think it was, I want to say it's Article 9 of the I'm blanking at the moment, but I do know it's Article 9 that does require funds to be reporting on the sustainability criteria for their companies. So we could actually talk about that offline in a more detailed manner, because that's a whole separate presentation on things. But yes, definitely funds are not out of scope overall for the overall impact, but for CSRD, I think for a fund perspective, particularly, excuse me, if you're looking at a private equity fund, if you're taking if you're going to take companies public, I think that's going to be a real issue, is are these companies going to be CSRD compliant in Europe? If it's a European based firm, I think that's something that might start to come up. Venture capital probably isn't going to be touched too much with that from that perspective.
Thanks, Heather. Another question, if companies are unable to fill in a particular data gap, how would they address this? Would this increase their risk of non-compliance?
That's a great question. It actually depends on whether that data gap is actually relevant for you. And you have to be really careful, because one data gap, for example, might look like if you don't have a policy on something. So if you you've done your double materiality and you see that, for example, we'll do a really obvious one. You've got a human rights issue in one of your areas, and your stakeholders now see that you've got a human rights issue and they realize you don't have a human rights policy. So the CSRD is really focused on disclosure. It's not really focused on corporate behavior. And I think that's a really important piece. So it's actually up to you at that point whether you wanted to put a policy in. But if you're looking at overall disclosure requirements, for example, you're going to have to comply or explain to a large degree. And if we don't have the resources to do it, that's not really going to fly. If you can prove that it's irrelevant for your company, then that's fine. Then you can really kind of circumvent certain reporting requirements. But if it's something that's relatively common, you need to figure out why you can't do that, and then probably completely self-serving comment. Hire advisors such as myself that can help you figure that out. But again, think of it of, is it relevant? If it isn't, you're fine. If it is, and you need to address it, you need to focus on that very, very quickly and figure out how much you can do in a short period of time.
Thanks, Heather. And just on that note, how do people find you? How can people contact you?
Oh, yes. Well, if we're going to send the presentation out, why don't we send that with my contact details for Sodali & Co. We've recently rebranded to our beautiful Sodali & Co. from Morrow Sodali. So if you have my old email address, that still works, but we can include my contact details on that. And myself and my team would be happy to talk to you.
Perfect. Well, I know we have a hard stop, and I know we still do have some questions remaining, but if you have anything that you'd like to send over to Heather directly afterwards, as we say, we'll share her contact details. Any final thoughts you'd like to leave the attendees with, Heather?
I think my final thought is, first, thank you for taking your lunchtime to listen to regulatory compliance. Again, for me being in sustainability so long, seeing it mature over time into a discipline that's actually being looked at alongside of financial reporting is very satisfying. But I do want to leave you with the idea that this is more than regulatory compliance, and you have a real opportunity here to tell your sustainability story in a much more appealing way, especially if you're creating two reports where you have your data set that hits all your compliance, hits all your rating agencies, is only read by machines, and you have another kind of more interesting narrative that you're talking about. Think about all the work you've done for sustainability. Is it getting recognized? We had a client we spoke to a few weeks ago that said, we're so good at this and we've been doing it so long and no one seems to care. Well, that's a communication issue. So know the compliance issue doesn't look like an opportunity, and I might be reaching to make this sound more exciting, but I would caution you to think that it could be an opportunity for you to become more efficient and tell your story better.
Wise last words, thank you. Just to clarify, the presentation materials won't be sent out, but we will be following up with contact details and a full write-up of this session in the coming week or so. So thank you, Heather, for sharing your time and expertise during your lunch break as well. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. Please do look out on the BCCJ website for any other upcoming events, and we look forward to seeing you soon.